It's Egyptian licorice tea.
Ah, we're in. Okay, we're live and direct.
Are you sure?
All right. If you're receiving signal in there, I guess you are. So let's get to it. I want to continue with addiction severity and treatment intensity. And I want to basically talk about the one thing that you can control no matter what setting you're in. So treatment can occur anywhere. And every encounter could be a therapeutic encounter. What is the difference is how intense you are. And there's different, so whether it's outpatient or inpatient, you're dealing with a human interaction. One of my teachers talked about caliber. And caliber is your personal effect. So just like, you know, he was in the Indian Army, so basically, you know, military, right? So if you shoot a BB at a pigeon, the pigeon's not gonna, it'll be hurt, but it won't be killed necessarily, depending on when you do the shot. 22 probably will be, but you know, a 50 cal will vaporize the pigeon. So he said, in terms of personal caliber, you know, not that you're blowing people away, but what kind of impact do you have on them? And that's your personal intensity, your personal caliber, which you can modify. So when I talk about Gautama Buddha and Isho, the person that you know by his Greek name, Jesus, Isho, so Gautama and Isho basically went to the same school, if you will, right? Their basic teaching is through understanding the causes of your suffering, you eliminate your suffering. So Buddha actually said, life is suffering. He wasn't having a bad day, he's just making an observation. That's true, life is suffering. And you suffer because you're attached to certain things, you're attached to things that pass. And you want them to come back, or, you know, so in combining that with what Yeshua said in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, he says, you suffer because you love what deceives you. So if you combine those two, as I have, so Buddha said life is suffering, and Isho says you suffer because you love what deceives you. So in addiction, life is suffering because you love what deceives you. So how does it deceive you? Life, okay? You believe in it more than your internal reality. So in the previous class, we had talked, not the previous class here, but CPSY200, part of the book list, and I think it might be in your book list too, but Jerry Mander wrote a book called 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television. And he was a television ad executive. So as an example, what do you believe? So you believe in the substances or the addictive substances or the addictive process more than your internal reality. And you become confused and you become deceived by that. Now, certain things like television, so in his book, 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television, Mander actually has 10 sub-arguments under the 4 main arguments. Okay? One argument against television, because remember, he was a television ad executive, so he designed ads. And basically, one of the things that he noticed is that people believed it if it was on television, because they believed that you couldn't put it on television unless it were true. Okay, so if you understand, so what he did in his second book, In the Absence of the Sacred, the Failure of Technology and the Survival of the Indian Nations. The reason he's talking about the Indian nations is he said, this was a culture based on knowing what your internal reality was that didn't necessarily have addiction. And they got supplanted by a culture that basically says, this is what your reality is, and we're going to tell you what your reality is. So one argument against television is the colonization of experience. That is, you believe what TV tells you. So, for example, the CSI effect, forensic evidence is always right. Follow the evidence. Okay, but what if it isn't? And what if you have flawed reality software? Oh, let me break that down some more. Come on. You can do it. Okay? Say, your relationship picker software. Why do good girls go for bad guys? Or vice versa? Your picker software. Why do you keep having bad relationships? Who are you attracted to? And why are you attracted to them? Who did you learn how to be attracted to? Did you go to relationship school? Oh, you didn't go to relationship school. Did you go to parenting school? Do you have a parenting license? No, the idea, when I talk to people about their picker software, it needs an upgrade in some cases. Or at least you need to know what it is. Right? So your relationship picker software comes partially from your quote-unquote normal experience of family, whatever that was. So normal is what happened to you. That was depicted as normal. I mean, I'm not going to say that there's a social norm, right? We're not in Ozzie and Harriet. How many of you even remember Ozzie and Harriet? You don't. Anyway, heterosexual white couple, middle class, dad goes to work, mom stays at home, white picket fence, 2.3 kids and a dog, cat, goldfish. That's normal, right? The 50s version of reality. Then we get the Brady Bunch. Then we get, Modern Family. All right? If it's on television, it has become normalized. This is one of Mander's arguments against television. You believe what's on TV, you believe that it's real. And with the net, because his argument in his second book about technology is that what the internet does, what having a computer does, is it gives you the power of advertising to basically, it makes television two-way. Television was like one way where it's being projected at you. With the internet, you're interacting with it. And you can shape reality. So you can pretend that, you're, sexual predators, just like they have to catch that show on cable, To Catch a Predator, right? So these guys are going after these, alleged young girls, except it's a police agent. Right? So, power of a computer, the internet, gives that kind of power in the hands of civilians, the power to deceive. Because people believe, oh, well, I learned about it on Wikipedia, so it must be true. Or it's on the internet, or,
It's like that one commercial where that girl comes up and is talking to this guy outside, and he's like looking for his insurance stuff.
Right.
And then she brings up her boyfriend from...
Yeah.
He's a Russian.
Bonjour. He's from France.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, the internet. But yes. So your relationship picker comes from your normal experience of family, whatever that was, or whatever got modeled for you. So in terms of treatment, so as a goal, within treatment or whatever framework you're working through, try and remain current with what's going on. In both society and in the science, and remain aware of what has gone on before, and to watch out for the comes around part of what goes around comes around. So it's going to change. Just like spice is to cannabis, yes, if you remember that item from the midterm, okay? Just like China white is to fentanyl. That stuff is going to come around again. Cannabinoids is a designer drug, and so designer drugs, research chemicals, same idea. Oh, well, you're the one that's doing the research on yourself. The fact that they even name it research chemicals, oh, it's science, it must be okay for me. I mean, really, just think about that. And the fact that you can get, free samples, like, right. Why are you trusting these people exactly? Okay, so the bottom line still comes down to, what is the condition the client is trying to cure or medicate with the behavior? What is the behavior a symptom of? Now, for them, it's not a symptom. For them, it's a goal. Well, they might even not even see it as a goal-oriented behavior, but all addiction is goal-oriented. So how can you have them reach that goal without that addictive behavior? Okay? And how do you address this within the context of treatment, which is still time and resource limited? Sometimes you have the luxury of meeting with a person one-on-one. Sometimes it's in a group. Sometimes you have to make a statement to a particular person in the context of a group. Okay? The main thing you have control of at all times is your intensity. So that's I want to spend a little bit of time looking at. Okay? Your intensity. It's your ability to be present, accurately see the client's world, and accurately tell the truth, particularly if it's an uncomfortable or dangerous truth. Dangerous to their self-concept as an addict. Okay, so for example, how does an African American male reach a white supremacist ex-con in treatment? Well, I've done this, and I've trained people to do this. It's actually not that difficult if you understand the principles. You can't be afraid of them. Right? Because prison is an environment that instills fear. Okay, so you can't be afraid of them in treatment. Okay, and you have to tell the truth. And you have to be able to empathize with them to the degree that what are they afraid of and what are they medicating? What truths are they trying to hide? And you're their exact opposite. So they're scared of you, particularly if you're telling the truth. Okay? So tell the truth without blame or judgment or fear about, in this particular case, it's his fears. So tell the truth about what he's afraid of. His vulnerabilities, which he wasn't allowed to express in prison, but could express in the context of a treatment group, and their human needs in terms of safeties. Okay? In a way that his fellow white supremacists do not, and probably can't or won't. That's how you reach them. Go to the center of their greatest pain and their greatest fear. Call it out in a way that's both safe, but also shakes up their world. That's pretty intense, to be able to sit and do that. All right, so contemporary treatment, generic treatment, basically looks at SA as substance abuse, eating disorders as ED, gambling, and then codependency issues in the patient, and simply looks at recovery in the individual patient client in the context of This is an African-American treatment person's phrase, not mine, but a friend of mine, preferred problem myopia. That is, we'll only look at certain issues, only substance abuse related issues. Okay, but when you're dealing with a white supremacist in treatment and you're black, you have to deal with race as an issue because that's part of what they're dealing with. You have to get over with them and be a credible source. So let's just deal with that up front. What's your relationship with black people? I mean, that's when I was telling you about Gary. I was the first black person that Gary had a conversation with. And the conversation had to be, what is your T cell count? If I make the appropriate referral to you, yeah, you can go to HIV Alliance for the gay men support group, but you don't even know that you're gay yet. Or you might not be. Because in Pendleton, they didn't teach you about sexual orientation. But if you go to the HIV support group, you're going to see guys at later stage of the disease that's going to depress you. You're going to drink because that's your coping skill. Drinking is going to plunge your T cell count. So if I make the appropriate referral, I might trigger a relapse. So I'm going to say, look, I'm not giving you permission to use, but I'm saying if you walk into this situation that's therapeutic, it might trigger you. Just be aware of the triggers up front. Doesn't matter that I'm black. I'm following the science. You didn't get this information from any of your sources. Same with Bjorn, the white supremacist who got gang raped by his homies in the Whitaker. Okay, in 40 days you need to get an AIDS test, but I'm going to get you into Buckley House today because you're shaking. I'm not afraid of you. I'm just afraid that you won't listen to me because of my excellent suntan. Just get it out of the way, whatever the barriers are going to be. Just tell them about it. That's raising your intensity. Think that encounter wasn't intense? Yeah, that's why I gave him some green tea and echinacea. So preferred problem myopia. Substance abuse is the only problem, must be dealt with in isolation. So it's not just that. So the slide that's going to come after this, what they should teach in school, was a brainstorm with a musician activist friend of mine, Alice D. Michelli, who raised kids and noticed what was missing in the standard curriculum, but what should be part of what we call home training. So, an example. The biopsychosocial model was created as a way of collecting intake data from the client or patient and molding it into the worldview of medicine with a 12-step overlay. Okay, for example, because I've been reading your biopsychosocials, right? So in past biopsychosocial, they reference client believes in a higher power. Okay, that's nice. So they're buying into the 12-step concept, but, okay, and they also, people would say as well, client could benefit from addiction education. So you have addiction as disease and addiction as maladaptive behavior, being able to compare and contrast the models, because the client isn't trained in that. And one of the challenges with getting well is you may or may not believe in the higher power. That might not necessarily guide your activities. Just like in cancer, do you have to believe in the model that they're using? Maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, so if you did them right, you gathered facts, not made guesses, didn't make assumptions. You gathered the client states, the client denies. So the use of the word denies, denial, don't even know I'm lying. They might actually not be lying, but the assumption in the language assumes that they are. They don't know that they're lying. That's denial. So what they should teach in school and in treatment. Self-gnosis, that is knowing yourself. a spiritual cartography. So that's not just what religion they are, but what is their inner world? Where do they come from? Where are they now? Where are they going? What is their connection to something greater than themselves? Nonviolent communication. Personal erogenous zone mapping. Where do you like to be touched and how? Why is that? Because of those natural rewards about, water, sex, nurturing, etc., etc. We don't learn this. This didn't happen in the plumbing lecture in middle school. If you got the plumbing lecture, the birds and the bees lecture, right? If we understand that sexuality is treated with a great deal of shame in this culture, all right, how do you overcome that? How do you have a healthy relationship? Touch me this way. Got to communicate. Right? Conscious contraception and conception. Tantra, sexuality which is focused on meditation, sacred sex, psychoecology, your relationship to the natural world, emotional hygiene, and then balancing your life, balancing your checkbook, investing and saving, money sadhana, that is a daily financial, spiritual discipline, and family financial planning. This should be part of treatment. Because where would they get this if they haven't gotten it? For example, if they had an underground economy source of income, then they don't know how to deal with money. Had a bank robber client. Came to Lane Community College as a student, referred through drug court. This guy came from a criminal family. Had spent most of his life incarcerated since 13. And he's 65. Okay? So when he robbed banks to support his drug habit, you get what? $2,000 maybe, whatever's in the till, because they intentionally limit that. Right? And then how long does the money last? Well, he said at most a week. Usually a couple of days, particularly if he went on a binge. And I wasn't trying to be intentionally stupid. I said, well, so did you have a savings account? Well, the idea is, did you make a budget? I mean, you lived somewhere, you had food, you had expenses, you had to buy toilet paper, right? I mean, yeah, you got $2,000, it's almost like a paycheck, but you had to keep doing it. You didn't learn any skills with money. And he admitted that. He said one of the skills, like the last time he was, he was basically facing a world where he was coming here, taking math classes. The last time he was free, Walmart didn't exist. What are these things called debit cards? Internet? Computers? And he's 65. Right? So, he had his first job. Legal job. Where do I put my first paycheck? $150. Well, in a bank. So he actually had to go to several banks, all of which he'd robbed before, and sit down with the new accounts person to walk him through how to deal with money. And because he's in recovery, had 5 years clean and sober, because he's in recovery, he had to be honest about what he'd done. But think about this with this particular client. Where do you learn money skills? Where do you see those modeled? Right. Why shouldn't that be a part of treatment? That should be. Right? And this is why when Alice and I are saying what should be taught in school and also treatment, it isn't being taught. You're depending on your family to teach you this, and if they don't, I remember my parents talking about, Dad would come home, and Dad's a doctor, Mom's a school teacher, and check bounced. And that seemed like a big deal. I mean, I was 8. I don't even know what they're talking. A check bounce? What's that? What was that for? The mortgage, the rent? I mean, it was a big deal. I didn't know. They didn't teach me till I got my own bank account. But this was just a brainstorm between somebody that's not officially in the trade, but it seemed, as a good meme, let's spread this, right? This is what they should teach in treatment, because this ups the intensity. It takes it beyond a substance abuse only construct. Okay, this is also what we do in black treatment agencies too, that are not necessarily 12-step. Practical life skills, because the lack of those practical life skills that they didn't learn, and definitely didn't learn in the underground economy if they were in it, definitely didn't learn on the stroll, if they're in the sex industry, how you deal with your money. So let's learn that. So the reality of treatment is that it's going to be limited to the time compensated by the insurance company, if there is one, or if it's publicly funded. It's going to be time limited. Or it's going to be limited by the material that is the emotional material willing to be referenced by the counselor from issues raised by the client. So in terms of treatment intensity, you need to take the initiative to address the intense stuff that you can sense that they're afraid of, because you're afraid of it. That's why I continue to say, go there, all right? Treatment time is not always determined by the intensity of the client's wounding or need for healing. Could also be your ability to be intense in terms of what you're telling the truth in. I once noticed an equation that said, the closer you get to truth, the more afraid you become. Fear is an indicator that there's a truth that's hidden. So you should approach it. Okay, so you can prepare your client for the road ahead by mentioning the things as they occur to you, or things that you know that they're going to encounter, to prepare them. And as your intuition or inner teacher guides you according to the needs of the client. So pay attention to your feelings, because sometimes your feelings are not actually your feelings, they're their feelings that you're feeling. Especially if you're within physical proximity with them longer than 15 minutes. That's why self-care is really necessary, for you to be able to pay attention to what you're feeling, and then how that changes in the presence of another being. Because you might not be feeling your feelings, you might be feeling theirs. And how do you walk them through that? Now, in psychology, they used to talk about a constellation of symptoms. And I'm using this not because I really like space, because I really like space, but the idea is a constellation of symptoms is a recognizable pattern of a problem, right? So you see that constellation, what's it called? Go ahead, say that again louder.
The Big Dipper.
The Big Dipper. Okay, what else is it called? Okay. Naturally, I'm going to tell you, right? Because it's important in the sense of the larger point that I'm making. Different cultures have different approaches to treatment. Right? So there's at least 5 different cultures that recognize this particular constellation. There are different cultures that have different approaches to addiction and they say, okay, this is what constitutes a problem. All right? So if you look at the extreme right, this star, alkade, does that sound familiar?
No.
Alkade.
Yeah,
Okay, so alkade, Mizar, Alioth, Megrez, Fekta, Mirak, Dabi. What language is that? Arabic. So they don't call it the Big Dipper in Arabic. So let me show you this. Okay, so the Big Dipper, that's how you know it, right? African slaves referred to it as the drinking gourd because why? Looks like a ladle. And the lip of the ladle, opposite the handle, points to what? North Star. Which is what? What's the name of the North Star? What?
Polaris.
Polaris, right? That's what we call it in Greek, but there's another name in Arabic, but we'll get to that. So the drinking gourd, because it points north, a particular direction. And north is freedom, right? So when we say addiction is slavery in African American culture, what is the way to freedom? What points the way to freedom? Marinate on that for a second. It's also called the Great Bear, Ursa Major. It's called the Great Bear because in Native American culture, this is a bear, because bears had long tails, and bear lost his tail because it went ice fishing and lost its tail. So now all bears have short tails now. I don't make this stuff up. In China, they refer to it as the starry plow. And in Arabic, they refer to it as al-mizan, the scales. So for example, the reason I brought up the whole alkade thing is I was playing basketball with a Palestinian man who's, local restaurateur, Ibrahim Hamide. So we were basically, rebounding inside. I got the ball and he tried to move me. Actually, he got the ball and, I set a pick against him and he couldn't move me. And he goes, wow, you're like a rock. And I said, how do you say that in your language? He said, alkade. What? No way. Really? Yeah. No, explain that more, because I know in your language a single word can mean multiple things. So what does alkade mean? And by the way, so I know that's also part of a star. Yeah, that's the star. Alkade means the commander. It also means the code. It also means, and this is what he's referring to in basketball, because I can't be moved, the foundation of the fortress wall. You don't want your fortress wall to be moved, right? So the commander, the code we live by, the foundation of the fortress wall that protects us. Interesting. So why is that part of, so what's the name of the constellation that we call the Big Dipper? He said Al-Mizan, the scales. Big scales, little scales. Because there's a Big Dipper, Little Dipper, right? Well, who put the scales there and what are they measuring? He said, well, God put the scales, Allah put the scales there and they're to measure justice. Infinite justice. And the reason I went off on, this little bird walk is because if you recall what the name of the military mission to Iraq was after 9/11, the first name that put the Arab world in this whole, probably rightfully paranoid. They called the mission Operation Infinite Justice. Oh, wait. Like Almazan, wait, we're already paranoid that America thinks it's God. So now you saying you're God? 9/11 retribution is infinite justice? So that's why they renamed it to Operation Iraqi Freedom. But basically it's talking about different cultures have different views, different approaches to the problem, right? So different names, different stories for the same thing, possibly different cures. Drinking gourd, Big Dipper, the starry plow, the great bear, Almazan. So constellation of symptoms. So different cultures place different salience on which symptoms. Okay, so for example, so salience, remember, which symptoms are more important, which do we address first? So description of symptoms does not lead to a practical cure by itself. A description of symptoms does indicate a worldview, that of problems, threats, needs, solutions, keep society safe. So the idea of the concept of constellations. Constellations have different mythologies about them, therefore different approaches to treatment come from different cultural frameworks. So for example, the native cultural framework behind the well-briety movement, our addiction comes from our loss of our traditional ways of life. We need to restore our traditional ways of life. On the way to doing that, we might or may not be abstinent because we've lost our way. How do you replace a traditional culture that was illegal to practice before 1978 with a sober one? Do we have to become Protestant Christians when our traditional spirituality isn't that? Because the higher power isn't the same as the Great Spirit. So part of the idea of the constellation of symptoms is like it's cross-cultural, right? The description of symptoms does not necessarily include the actual worldview of people suffering from those symptoms. So remember, in terms of drapetomania, slaves were crazy for escaping slavery. Okay? The problem was not the existence of slavery. The solution was not ending slavery in that worldview. The solution was treating the slaves because they were crazy. Right? And this is the worldview of DSM. We're describing symptoms, but the symptom might be living in a society that's not sane from one point of view. Okay, so for example, in the worldview of addiction and slavery, white people think we're crazy for believing we can or need to create our own healing from racism. APA doesn't believe in racism, so we're saying we do, so we're going to create our own healing from it. You know, and so we're post-racial. We have a black president now. So Alice Walker, famous black author, says, remove the arrow of racism from your heart first, heal your heart, then worry about the archer. She's basically saying, suppose you got hit in the heart with an arrow. Would you waste your time looking for the archer? And what if the archer wasn't even in view? No, you take the arrow out of your heart first. Would you get the archer to apologize? They probably won't. And what if the archer is, you or your folks? Because sometimes the archer is us. No, you got to focus on healing your heart first. Then heal your heart, then worry about the archer. Okay, go to the center of the greatest pain. Heal it in the most appropriate way. Right? So that's an African framework in terms of addiction to slavery. Go to the heart of the hurt. Go to the place you're scared of. First. That's about treatment intensity. So, PTSD culture, the culture that came up with the term PTSD, does not recognize multi-generational trauma or post-slavery stress disorder. The idea that, oh, it's not just my response to stress, it's that my people have been stressed too, and that's part of what my problem is. Right? ADHD or learning disabilities might not be actual individual failures, but a systemic inability to reach or educate certain people, or recognize that their deficits are due to having their attention captured by trauma at home or being colonized by media or abusers or poverty. The problem might not be in them. The problem might be in the society around them. Okay, but treatment and or the correction system doesn't look at it that way. You're the problem and you have to correct your behavior. And sometimes if you're working in one of those fields, you have to, on the surface, adopt that. Look, it does come down to behavior, what you're doing. But you also have to understand what happened to you. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. Okay? Poverty is a form of systemic violence, not an individual choice. Okay? Multi-generational poverty is reinforced systemic violence which has been normalized over many generations. And poverty isn't just about what your job is and how much money you have. It is also access to information that could be reinforced. Hate to bring this up as a class analysis, but again, I have a tactical advantage coming from being descended from slavery. I do not trust systems. I educate myself because I don't trust the system to educate me. Just do not. So, like I said when I came here, wait, you go multiple generations without going past 8th grade because you think Warehouse is going to give you a job. Wow, why do you trust them? Because they're white? Really? Why? See, I couldn't understand that. So poverty is also about your education, not what you are given in school, what you access yourself to. And choosing not to access more information when it will help you. And so treatment is also part of the educational system, in a sense. So it's not just being able to get your GED, it's also understanding how your world has been shaped. Because it has been shaped. Right? Solutions to poverty come from those who are poor, but not poor in spirit. Okay, so that's another form of wealth. Spirituality, a sense of connection, a sense of wisdom, is a form of wealth that is not measured by how much you go to church. That Black Addictions Council reaching out to the white supremacist was not poor in spirit. I'm not afraid of you. We're the same being. And he's going to church every Sunday. I have to help you out. I have to forgive you. And part of that forgiveness is I'm going to help you through this. That's not poor in spirit. That's rich in spirit. Okay? So spirited means you have an adaptive response to adversity. You can think outside the box that is shown to you by society. Some of us think that the system we refer to as white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, also known as the matrix of domination, instills a learning disability that keeps people from perceiving, let alone utilizing naturally occurring human diversity. You're taught not to recognize diversity or see yourself connected in the other. You're taught to do that. We are all taught to do that. That's a learning disability that's induced. See, that's flipping the script. The learning disabilities and ADHD, oh, well, that's a problem in the individual. But wait a minute, what if you created those folks? What if those folks were created? How would they get out of that particular box? Okay? So, for example, for some white people to call other white people poor white trash, whose responsibility is it that you don't feel the need to uplift or educate those in need? How do you create a system by which people are denied access to the wisdom to change their social standing? Why would you keep it from them? Like those of you who are parents, which kid do you not feed? You go without food for yourself before not feeding your kids. Who decides that people don't get what they need? So how this relates in treatment. So, why is there no Larry the Cable Guy or Joe the Plumber Poor People's Rehab show? Why is there only celebrity rehab? These are not the things that keep me up at night, but I just noticed in terms of the colonization of experience, celebrity rehab. Like, why would we care about celebrities more than Joe the Plumber or Larry the Cable Guy?
Illuminati.
Huh?
Illuminati.
Yeah. It's true. But it also sends a message about who recovery is for, too. Those can afford treatment? What?
Can you go back?
Yeah, I
Just
can.
for a second?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, constellation of symptoms. PTSD, PSSD, and multi-generational trauma is one symptom. ADHD, another symptom. Learning disability, poverty, domestic violence, and self-injury. So alcohol and drug use, and isms. So these symptoms are things that could show up in a single client of any race or ethnicity or any culture. So addiction treatment usually just focuses on the substance use, that is the A and D, and maybe looks at domestic violence or self-injury if it's a female client. And perhaps addresses poverty. Maybe. But all these might exist simultaneously. So part of treatment intensity might be looking at the influence of all these and addressing them. Because sometimes learning disabilities aren't about whether you're ADHD, because then the cure is giving you a drug to cure your ADHD. It might be something you've been taught or not taught by society that should be addressed in treatment.
Yeah, that's what I don't understand about when you go to a doctor or something, or a counselor, like South Mental Health or something, and you just talk to them for like a brief say 5 minutes, whatever, and then they say, well, we can put you on this medication because it's only costs $4 at Walmart. You know, you think your brain's worth more than $4. That's the way I, do it. But how can they actually tell you what kind of medicine to get on? I mean, if they've only seen you for 5 minutes, I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Well, that's partially a function of how medicine works in this country, right? So, my father used to talk about, and counselors get trained on a 50-minute hour, i.e., you were seeing a client for 50 minutes. Well, as a psychiatrist, he can only do that in his private practice. In the publicly funded practice, insurance will own, that is the state, will only pay for 15 minutes. Okay, so if you've been to a doctor recently, other than say our health clinic, but even our health clinics to some degree, okay, your doctor's with you for 10 minutes while you've been waiting for half an hour, right? And they charge you $800 or $200 or whatever for those 15 minutes. And then they prescribe a medication, right, based on your ability to pay. $4 at Walmart rather than whatever else. And that might be an economic decision, not a medically based decision. So, constellation of signs towards healing. So, in PTSD, PSSD, MGT, what is the wound? How is it healed? ADHD, where attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it doesn't mean that they're unable to pay attention. It just means that you have to up the intensity to pay attention to what has meaning for them. Because they have no problem paying attention to the things that they're interested in. You just have to shift what they're interested in. Okay, learning disability. Yeah, well, what do you feel? Paying attention to that inner world, not necessarily just whether you can read at a certain level. What do you feel? Poverty as a symptom. So what is your inner wealth? What is your spiritual wealth? That is your capability of overcoming in adversity. That inner wealth. DV and SI, understanding, okay, you don't need to injure yourself, particularly if you've been hurt by others. You can begin to understand what's happening to you and act towards your own healing. A and D, the signs toward healing, harm reduction, abstinence, recovery. So within the current 12-step and also the medical model, recovery begins with abstinence. Though they might say that we're going to put you on pharmaceuticals. And there, of course, is going to be some argument in the recovery community whether that's actually recovery. So isms, then skill building. To deal with the isms, to identify them and overcome them. And again, this is still part of treatment. Treatment intensity. Being able to address these particular things. Not just the A&D piece, but that they're related. They're connected. So we did Kathy, Gary, and Mike already, so I can skip that, right? Here we go. I'll leave that up, but I'll continue with the next one. How do you help people? So, when the only tools you have don't give practical resolution to their problems, for example, DSM-5 or 4R, since some people are still using that, it doesn't exist for systemic neglect, especially as this construct was developed for dealing with institutional racism, but racism is not necessarily the salient symptom for everyone. But lots of people are systemically neglected. Okay, so if there is systemic neglect, this results in a lack of institutional and individual cultural competence and proficiency, that is, skill with dealing with systemic discrimination. So for example, if you're bipolar, have attachment disorder, PTSD, you're dually diagnosed, you have gender identity dysphoria, is your only hope medication? Well, they would tend to think that. You would tend to think that by the response to treatment. Oh, take Prozac, take this pill. Well, so I needed a new model. So I created one. And I call it Axiochemistry. So here's how that works. So axiology is a branch of philosophy which studies values. Like, why do people believe what they believe? What are their core beliefs? And chemistry is the study of the effect of and the relationship between exogenous and endogenous chemicals on the human spirit. The idea exogenous outside of the body, endogenous inside the body, the effect of those chemicals on the human spirit. How do you change your neurochemistry on your own without a drug? How do drugs change your neurochemistry? Skills versus pills. Okay, so the reason it's spelled that way, Kemet, Egypt, from which the technology to create distilled spirits was derived, and the cultural values, laws, science, and policy regarding those of spirits' effect on the human spirit. So in the creation of alcohol, if you recall from way back, right? We being Africans, did not allow distilled spirits among the general population because of the effect that it had on people's morality. Yeah, we could have made money from it, oodles. But no, we don't want to do that. But what happens then when in that cultural value, if the technology gets out of that culture, other cultural values get applied to it. Just like with tobacco. Oh, we only use this for prayer. Once a day, and you don't inhale. 2 Marlboros. Different cultural values, different drug technologies shift from different cultures. So, axiochemistry is also the study of a particular culture's drug technology, including the uses which make up that particular culture's pharmacology, drug laws, and standard healthcare praxes, where praxes is the plural of praxis. That is the theory, where theory and practice interface and change each other. Okay? And how problems start and how to heal them. So Edwin Nichols he's still alive, a African-American industrial psychologist who created a model to study how 4 different cultures interact in the workplace and in society. And basically I applied that model to drug technology. So first premise, the koan of culture. So a koan is kind of like a jawbreaker for the mind out of Asian axiology. So the koan of culture. The first question you ask is, what is the practitioner's culture? If you're the practitioner. What is your culture? And then, what is the client's culture? And what is the optimal praxis for that culture? Now, optimal, they might not be doing the optimal one. Joe Sixpack is drinking a case, not a six-pack. But even if he is drinking a six-pack, that's better than a case, but he's still binge drinking. So the ultimate goal would be abstinence. That would be ultimately healthy. But if we can get him to drink 2 beers rather than the 6-pack or the case, that's all to the good. Right? So that's recognizing his culture, but okay, the medically optimal thing would be for you not to drink, especially if your liver says you shouldn't be drinking. Right? Where does culture reinforce and optimize health? What has he learned in terms of his drug use from, say, television or the internet or his peer group? What's normal behavior? You know, the client, for example, who drank a 5th of vodka a day. How is that normal? Well, that happens often enough, so there are people reinforcing that as normal behavior. Where does culture reinforce and optimize addiction? And which cultural artifacts are useful? Because the way to treat them might not be in their culture because their culture might not have developed a recovery mode. Okay, that's why with Gary I use, okay, it's not that whether you're gay or heterosexual, you might be two-spirited. And sometimes cultures don't necessarily have all the answers, so you have to create them. Create a solution out of your intuition. So, the practitioner's culture. So, we're trained as practitioners, for example, to deal with DSM 4R and 5, which is essentially wealthy white male doctors determining what is normal for everybody. I mean, not to put too fine a face on it, right? So what is the client's culture? How closely does that culture come to what wealthy white male doctors consider normal? You know, what happened to the client? What did they have to do to survive? What tools do they have to understand and cope with what happened? Is that within their culture? Well, that if it isn't, it should be part of treatment. This is, again, another way of modifying treatment intensity. And what is the optimal praxis for that culture? Does that culture have its own science that works better than DSM science? So the client's culture, where does it reinforce and optimize health? Where does it reinforce and optimize addiction? What cultural artifacts, that is, beliefs, practices, skills, knowledge are useful? Are they indigenous to their culture, or adoptable or teachable by that culture? So, for example, universal precautions. You know what those are? You been to a dentist? Why do they wear gloves? Huh?
Don't touch any bacteria.
Bodily fluids.
Bodily fluids. Okay? It's a blood-borne pathogen. It's called universal precautions. It's basically brought about because of HIV. Okay, and the assumption is this. Assume everybody's infected. So no contact with, I mean, you could have an HIV-positive dentist, as there had been, who infected their patients, working in their mouths. Yes, that has happened. Okay? Third world countries, but also some dentists here who didn't autoclave their instruments and just used them between patients, spreading disease. That has happened here. Okay, so universal precautions. You assume everybody's infected, you protect yourself. All right, that's a cultural artifact that has been adopted by our field. Now, with isms, we haven't exactly talked about that yet, but we will. The idea, systemic discrimination, those are spread through the culture. Basically, if you speak English, you're infected.
By what?
Hmm?
By what, the culture?
You're infected by the culture, because language is a virus, as it were, right? But you have certain ideas about who you are and who other people are that may be reinforcing a system of discrimination. Okay, same with drug behavior. You know, fifth of vodka is normal. A weed grows okay, but a meth lab is not. Certainly weed grows less toxic than a meth lab. But, you know, what are some of the beliefs that we have around, you know, addictions and addictive practices? Those are cultural artifacts. And what are the ways of health? So what cultural artifacts need to be created? So sometimes new emerging problems have never been faced before. For example, like research chemicals. Part of the need for people to change their consciousness, it is a need. But, and part of that need drives drug-taking behavior, but that need can be met without drugs. But we don't teach that, especially in an addictive society. So part of the koan of culture, this is me using my poetic license. The koan, so this is the koan of culture as a haiku. A haiku is basically a form of Japanese classical poetry with 17 syllables. 5, 7, 5, 3 lines usually. So this is in 4 lines. So culture, causes, cures. Violence, sickness, disease, death, disease. All must find their peace. And peace is spelled 2 ways. It is I who must find a peace, and piece by piece find peace. So culture reinforces both health and addiction. So for example, with the powder drugs that are shown in the upper part of the graphic, snorting, shooting, smoking, okay? Those are all equivalent when a client is doing them. That's inpatient treatment. That's part of the protocol within our field. That's medically driven. But part of the cure, and this is a well-variety construct, basically looking at understanding through the 4 directions. Like what stage of life are you in? 4 stages of life: child, youth, adult, elder. 4 races: yellow, black, red, white. 4 animals in the 4 directions: eagle, mouse, bear, buffalo. And the qualities, east illumination, south innocence, west introspection, north wisdom. So how do you integrate those for healing? So multiple layers of the 4 directions. That's within the well-variety movement as a construct for healing from addiction. Were you a wounded child? Are you a wounded elder? What happened to you in adolescence to produce, or your childhood, to produce you as a wounded adult or wounded elder? How do you heal with that? Do you need to see like an eagle? Do you need to see what's up close like a mouse? Do you need to dream deeply like a bear? So what are the cultural healing artifacts? What reinforces addiction? What is the way out within your culture? And if your culture doesn't have the answer, outside of your culture. Again, another way of using culture to push and increase treatment intensity. Sometimes the answer doesn't lie within their culture. So culture is a pattern that shapes and is shaped by individuals. It determines policy, structures, education, conversation, the zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is it's a German word which means the spirit of the times. And who becomes a hungry Geist? That's a Buddhist term which means hungry ghost. The idea it's a human who was absorbed with addictions and then dies. So they don't have their body anymore, but they still have the addiction. And they can influence humans under the influence, among other things, to feed their addiction. So bodhicitta is, I actually should change that so you can see it. Bodhicitta may be defined as the union of compassion and wisdom. Relative bodhicitta refers to a state of mind in which the practitioner works for the good of all beings as if it were their own. It's almost like Buddha nature. Like bodhicitta goes along with being a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva has achieved enlightenment. They don't have to reincarnate, but they choose to reincarnate to help others. So bodhicitta is part of that. You're working for the good of others. Okay? Culture determines who can talk about what, when, where, and how, or even if it is a subject for polite society. For example, you can't do HIV prevention if you can't talk about sex. Globally, the spread of AIDS, a heterosexual disease, because globally the spread of AIDS is a heterosexual disease, is tied to whether women can access and use barrier methods of contraception. And say no glove, no love. You can't say that unless you have the access, and you can't have the access unless your culture allows you to do it. Or even broach the subject. So that's where globally we see AIDS spreading, where women aren't allowed to do that. Even have the conversation. So there's other health behaviors that are like that. So a mokita is a thing that everyone knows and nobody talks about. It's another word or a phrase for mokita is like the elephant in the room. So when can a mokita be discussed publicly? When you have the language to discuss it. So of course, Obama got elected because he's not too dark and he can talk good. So race is still a factor as an example, but Ray Charles could see that with Stevie Wonder's glasses. So the trick is to see how culture has shaped your own biases and correct your behavior for those biases as if they could be wrong. That is, the culture could be wrong. Your biases might be correct, but if you approach them with they might be wrong, you can learn as a skill to suspend them. Okay? Your constructs of normal might not, in fact, be healthy. Sane and normal behavior actually, in one culture, might actually be addictive behavior. So, for example, Cartwright. We talked about him? All right. He was one of the one of the critics of people like Cartwright. So, he was a Confederate doctor, Confederate doctors did experiments on slaves without anesthesia because they didn't believe blacks were advanced enough to feel pain, i.e. not human, they're animals. And this was a normal feature of the Confederacy, which was not a one-person, one-vote democracy based on gender, class, or racial equality. That was normal for the Confederacy. So this guy, Samuel Cartwright, is the guy who coined Drapetomania aegypticus, that is, slaves are crazy for escaping slavery. And he was one of the founding fathers that influenced the APA, the American Psychological Association, who has the DSM, which is probably why, this is one of the historical reasons probably why APA doesn't recognize racism as a psychological or emotional effect to this day, because of people like him. So that's why Maroons study history, because, okay, that doesn't make sense, but now when you understand this is a homie of Benjamin Rush, and Benjamin Rush founds the American Psychological Association, all starts to make sense. Frantz Fanon is a black psychiatrist who who basically came up with the idea of sociostructural violence, which basically means systems cause violence against individuals. And he pointed out we have a psychology which says violence is perpetrated between individuals, and you have a perpetrator and a victim, and an act which can be punished. So we're conditioned to think of violence only between individuals and not systems. Thank you. So next week we'll actually be looking at that. So people of the four directions have different sciences. So basically comparing, contrasting two different psychiatrists, two different medical personnel which have vastly contrasting views. So Fanon basically noticed that he's a psychiatrist trained in France, and he was noticing when he was posted in North Africa that white mental patients with a certain diagnosis and black mental patients with the same diagnosis, the white people got medication and therapy, and the black people got torture in the same hospital. So that treatments were definitely bifurcated because of race, not because of medicine. And that was normal for that particular culture, which is colonialized France, in the 50s. All right, so we'll continue this more next week.